I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds and welcome to my horror house. The new year has brought a treat for horror fans in the form of a new adaptation of Dracula. Over 3 90-minute episodes being screened. First one last night, January the 1st, then the second and the third, and I believe on the 4th all 3 will be made available on Netflix. It's an adaptation from Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, the 2 writers behind the recent modern update Benedict Cumberbatch-a-thon Sherlock adaptation. I had everything crossed because Dracula was either going to come from the writers of Sherlock Season 1 or Sherlock Season 3. And like a box of chocolates, as Forrest Gump would say, you never know what you're going to get next. So last night the first episode aired. It was called The Rules of the Beast, and straight off the bat, I'm not going to be continuing to make comparisons between this and Sherlock, but the Cliff Notes version is, if you are after a more faithful adaptation from the BBC, I would suggest their 1977 offering with Louis Jordan. He was my first Dracula, by the way, so I think at some point in 2020, off the back of this adaptation, I'm definitely going to revisit this Dracula and talk about it. But in the same way with Sherlock, as they clearly have an incredible love of the source material, but not to the extent that they aren't willing to be irreverent and indeed iconoclastic with their modern day retelling of Sherlock. I think the same is very similar with Dracula. They're incredibly beholden to Bram Stoker's original. They clearly love the story and love the characters, but they're not afraid to be iconoclastic and give you something that has the taste of the familiar but might not have everything that you expect it to be. It is not a from the page straight to the screen adaptation of Dracula. That's going to put an awful lot of people off. But honestly, really, the number of interpretations and reimaginings of Dracula that we've had over the years, this isn't necessarily a hill to die on. So what we're going to look at is how good this actual Dracula is. And I saw it once last night when it aired. And once you get used to kind of what they're going for and the tone, I am really pleased that they're screening all 3 episodes back to back, and I get my next little taste of Dracula tonight and my final taste tomorrow night, because with some reservations, I really dig it. That's not to say that it didn't take me a little while to settle into the kind of Dracula they were presenting and the kind of story they were telling, because I did need to bed into it. And I think the episode needed to bed into itself as well. And it started off with the first This Is Horror musical sting, and an image was a awful CGI close-up of a fly, and then in very short order after that there was an awful swarm of CG bats while the camera was swirling around and around Jonathan Harker as he was knocking on the door of Castle Dracula. And I thought, oh, this is overblown nonsense, until Harker gets into Castle Dracula and starts conversing with the Count, and then everything just seems to settle down. That section is the most like the book, and honestly, if there's a section of Bram Stoker's novel that you don't tinker with too much, it's Harker in Castle Dracula. That's perfect. I've seen some people on Twitter, I mean, they meddle with it even more than some purists would like or would want. My advice would be is, if you want Bram Stoker's Dracula, read the book. But there's certainly a push and a pull throughout this episode to do a decent period set adaptation of a novel and also have a flashy sort of knowing 2020 current adaptation of Dracula. It's not so much that an awful lot of the dialogue is on the nose, because I don't think it is, but some of it, some of the worst instincts of Moffat and Gatiss to be all meta and acknowledging how clever they are, aren't in this, thankfully. Not the way it sort of rushed into season 3 of Sherlock, but you can see that imp of the perverse, that instinct, is still in there in them, and we've still got 2 more lots of 90 minutes for them to do a round of backslapping and sink the whole affair. I'm hoping they're able to restrain themselves, because the balancing act they've got going on at the moment more or less works. So yes, once we get into Castle Dracula, that segment is fantastic. The set looks great. Dracula's an old man in it, as he is in the novels. And what you get with a 90-minute episode, which is one of 3, is the luxury to be able to let certain things breathe and evolve in a way that you can't do in a 90-minute or even a 2-hour movie. So even in some of the best film adaptations of Dracula, the Harker and Castle Dracula stuff is strong. How could it not be with the source material? But is just Act 1, whereas this was more or less the whole 90 minutes, or at least the first 2 acts. So you get to spend more time in the space, see the characters interact more over. You get the sense that Harker is there for that extended period of time that he is in the novels. They get the chance to play a little bit with the history, the cinematic history of the character. So let's start talking about the performance of Dracula by Claes Bang. So at first, Dracula is old, and there will be elements of it, and even certain shots that will remind you, how could it not, of the Francis Coppola movie Bram Stoker's Dracula. There's a note in one scene of Gary Oldman's performance as the old man Dracula. I think he's channeling more of Klaus Kinski and Werner Herzog's Nosferatu. One of the things this 90-minute breathing period gives us is a really nice evolution of Dracula getting younger and more vital as he's draining the life force out of Jonathan, who is becoming iller and more shrunken. So we move fantastically from a sort of Klaus Kinski old man, foreign Transylvanian sounding Dracula, who's becoming more and more anglicised, which I absolutely adore. It's in the book. The Count's plan is to spend enough time with Harker so that he can pass on the streets of London as someone born and bred there. He won't come across as a foreigner. This is the first time I've ever seen this actually played out, where Dracula is not just feeding off Jonathan for sustenance, but he absorbs the man's knowledge and memories in with his blood. So his accent improves. He starts becoming more of a modern man, a modern Englishman, rather than an ancient Transylvanian vampire. And I've never seen that develop quite so much. And it's really fascinating. He gets one moment, as he's getting more and more vital, the scene where Jonathan discovers Dracula in his tomb, where he gets to go, just for a couple of seconds, but full on Christopher Lee, which I guess everyone must have got an absolute kick out of. And then it's a quick hop, skip and a jump into Claes Bang's Dracula, which I'd like to welcome him to the actors pantheon of Draculas, because I really like what he's doing here and what the script is asking him to do. This is a Dracula who is having fun. He is an evil character. But as he becomes more vital and regains his youth, and he has a purpose and a plan, he's enjoying himself. There are, I would say, too many one-liners. There are some dark jokes and some quips he does. If I were being picky, it's a little too quippy for me, but this is the Dracula we've got for 2020, and if they want to go there, I'm on board for that. There are references to other vampire movies and other horror movies as well. Dracula's cellar of previous victims is a strong nod to the end of The Hunger, the Catherine Deneuve, David Bowie vampire movie, that Tony Scott movie. There's perhaps a little nod to The Exorcist in there, and There's a brilliant nod to The Shining as well. Some of the changes may infuriate people, and I know that gender swapping for the sake of it riles an awful lot of people, and I don't see why you would expend energy getting angry about that. But if that's the kind of thing that does get on your nerves, I actually think it pays off here really well. There's the person set up in opposition to Dracula in this first episode is a nun, Sister Agatha, who is versed in the occult and versed in vampires and wants to learn as much as she can from Harker and his account of his stay in Castle Dracula, because Dracula, by all accounts, is a very singular kind of vampire. He's very successful at being a vampire, and we learn towards the end of the episode that Sister Agatha's surname is Van Helsing. She is going to be the Van Helsing of Dracula 2020, and I don't care what gender she is, because this character is absolutely phenomenal. An agnostic at best, nun who doesn't believe in the power of faith to save you from evil, but believes in the power of knowledge and accruing knowledge as weapons against the forces of evil. And she absolutely sets herself up in opposition to Count Dracula in a phenomenal standoff at the gates of the nunnery, where he can't come in because he hasn't been invited, and they are nose to nose. But she's so fascinated and interested to have this example of supernatural evil in front of her that she's also curious, and she wants to know and needs to know what the limit of his powers are. So she's quite happy to prod him and anger him into revealing his limitations and understanding what weapons she can bring to bear against him. There's a representation of vampirism in this that we haven't seen before, which is also why I'm extremely eager for the next 2 episodes. I like new twists on the vampire myth, and the understanding here is that vampires exist, and even Sister Agatha knows that vampires exist, but usually over a relatively short period of time. They kind of don't really handle their immortality well and sort of go crazy and go feral and become more animalistic and become less human. The reason she's so fascinated in the Count is that he seems to have done what no other vampire can do, and for century upon century upon century maintain his human form and maintain his, well, for want of a better word, mask of humanity, and he can push down the bestial aspect of himself. And she suspects it's because he's very particular about whose blood he drinks from, and so I think, as she says, like the aristocrat he was, he only likes the finest things in life. So if the idea is that through the blood you absorb the memories and the knowledge of the people that you're feeding from, if he only takes from well-to-do, intelligent, educated people, then he can remain intelligent, educated, and well-to-do. The episode is called Rules of the Beast, and one of the things it does is set out these other rules that these vampires in this adaptation follow, and they're all the standard rules. You can't come in unless you're invited. The cross repels Dracula. Sunlight will kill him. The thing I'm really interested in is that Sister Agatha Van Helsing, says, as far as Dracula is concerned, all these ancient legends seem to be true, but they don't make sense. I don't understand why any of this should be. So why does he have to be invited? Why is he afraid of the cross when all other vampires aren't afraid of the cross? And Dracula hints that there is a reason for it, and she surmises that there is one reason. There's one thing that Dracula fears, which all of these other weaknesses are a symptom of. And I know that we're going to get there, because I know Gatiss and Moffat, they're teasing something, they're teasing a new take on the old vampire myth, and they're going to give us the answer why, probably the end of episode 3, and I can't wait to see why that would be. This isn't a family viewing adaptation of Dracula whatsoever. There are moments of extreme horror. There's little squicky moments, flies going behind eyeballs. There, you'll have characters decapitated. You'll have little undead babies. A phenomenal scene, which really is only in here because they're able to take 90 minutes to explore Harker in Castle Dracula, is showing us Jonathan's mental capacity crumbling, showing him becoming mad, for want of a better word, and a beautiful scene where Dracula is absolutely gaslighting him and has a bag with a newborn baby in it that's crying, which he's going to feed to one of his brides. And Harker can barely now really hold on to a coherent thought at this point and keeps saying, I can hear a baby, there's a baby in that bag. Dracula's saying, there's no baby, Jonathan, there's no baby. And it's horrible, and it's really brings home the true horror of that masterful section of Bram Stoker's novel where poor old Jonathan is trapped in an ancient castle with an ancient evil and is thoroughly doomed, and reduced to the point where up is now down, left is right, and black is white. Episode 1 goes out with an absolute bang, which I won't spoil for you, and I really cannot wait for episode 2 tonight and episode 3 tomorrow night. I hope it maintains this quality and sense of fun, if not improves on it. I suspect tonight's episode is called Blood Vessel, and from the brief clip we saw at the end of last night's episode, I suspect that the vast majority of episode 2 is going to take place during Dracula's sea voyage to England. I think he's going to be on a passenger ship rather than the Demeter from the novel. I've had a quick look at the cast list that's up on Wikipedia, and I think that everyone more or less from the novel we've already had. I don't think we're going to get Lucy, Arthur Holmwood, Dr. Seward, because I don't see any of those characters listed in the cast. So I think the boat voyage in episode 2 is going to give them the opportunity to just present a whole load of new characters who aren't in the book, to fall under the shadow of Dracula while he's on his journey. One thing I am interested in is there is the Bloofer Lady, a character listed as the Bloofer Lady, who is, of course, in the novel what Lucy becomes when she is turned into a vampire and starts feeding on children. So I'm really glad we're seemingly going to get some sort of version of Vampire Lucy once we get to England. But it seems now, as far as adaptation of the novel goes, all bets are off. So I can't wait to see, honestly, what happens next.